So I have one sacred text. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil. Henry David Thoreau, 1846, on Walden. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. Call the one a root striker. Here's the argument. There's a feeling today in my country among too many of my fellow citizens that we Americans might not make it. Not that the end is near or that doom is around a corner, but that a distinctly American feeling of inevitability, of greatness, culturally, economically, politically, is gone. That we have become Britain or Rome or Greece. Now, a generation ago, Ronald Reagan rallied the nation to deny a similar charge by Jimmy Carter, the fear that our nation had fallen into this state of malaise. And I confess, I was one of those so rallied, and I still believe that Reagan was right. But the feeling I'm talking about today is different. It's not that we as a people have lost anything of our potential, but that we as a republic have. That our capacity for governing, the product in part of a constitution we have revered for more than 2 centuries, has come to an end. That the thing that we were once most proud of, our republic, is the one thing that we have all learned to ignore. Government is an embarrassment. It has lost the capacity to make the most essential decisions, and slowly it dawns upon us that a ship that cannot be steered is a ship that will sink. Now, this is not a Democratic or Republican point alone. This is a genuinely multi-partisan frustration. The view that this government doesn't work is signaled by many different policy matters that get blocked on both the left and the right, blocked consistently and repeatedly in a way that should drive us Thoreauvians, to ask, what is the common root? Now, my job here tonight is to brainwash you a little bit about what that common root might be. I want to do that with 3 examples. So as described in the introduction, I spent many years of my life focused on the area of copyright. And I became a copyright activist on October 27, 1998, when President Clinton signed into a law a statute in honor of this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. Now, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. And the question Congress was to ask when it passed that statute was whether it could advance the public good to extend the term of an existing copyright by 20 years. Now, a copyright, of course, is a monopoly given to create the incentive to produce something new. And what we know about incentives in this universe is that incentives are prospective. Not even the United States Congress could get George Gershwin to produce anything more. So that when we challenged this statute in the Supreme Court and had a brief signed by 13 economists, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, including this liberal Nobel Prize, this is Milton Friedman, right-wing Nobel Prize winner. Milton Friedman said he would join the brief, arguing it could not advance the public good only if the word no-brainer was somewhere in the brief. So obvious was it that you could not extend the public good by extending the term of an existing copyright. But there apparently were no brains in this place when Congress unanimously extended the term of existing copyrights. What there was more than $6 million in contributions from Disney and related interests eager to have their copyright extended, the public demand notwithstanding. Here's a second example. Think about Wall Street. We've just seen this collapse on Wall Street, which triggered a collapse in the economy and the economies around the world. What explains that collapse? Well, in this book by Simon Johnson and James Quack, they attribute this collapse to this perverse mix, a mix of both too little government and too much government. Too little government in the sense of deregulation. The 1990s saw this explosion of financial innovations, what we call derivatives. But because of a series of regulatory changes, these innovations were essentially invisible to the marketplace. There was no requirement that these innovations be traded on a public exchange, no transparency obligation, not even an obligation that they comply with anti-fraud requirements. So as my colleague Frank Partnoy calculated, in 1980, 98% of assets traded in our economy were traded on these public exchanges. But by 2008, 90% of the assets traded in our economy were traded in these invisible shadow banking markets. No requirement for public disclosure, no requirement for transparency, no anti-fraud requirements at all. And that, of course, encouraged, Johnson and Quack argues, the bubble that when it burst brought the economy down. But that alone was not enough. In addition to too little government, there was too much government, because through the 1990s there was a clear beacon from the federal government to the financial sector that there was in effect a government guarantee that when this bubble burst, there would be a bailout at the other side, producing what is the dumbest form of socialism ever invented by man. We socialized the risk while privatizing the benefit. We paid the downside, they got the upside. Now, I know this isn't a legal audience, and this is a technical legal term, but let me just describe this as insanely stupid way to architect a financial system. What explains the stupidity? Now, all of that was before 2008. It gets worse after 2008, when the proverbial insult gets added to injury in the context of Congress of the United States. Because after 2008, after the worst crisis since the Depression, after everyone not tied to Wall Street reviewing this crisis concluded on the left and the right that the crisis was in large part driven by the misregulation, by the deregulation of Wall Street. After the dean of deregulation, the Ayn Randian Alan Greenspan, head of the Federal Reserve, confessed he had made a, quote, mistake in believing the banks would act in the public interest as opposed to their private interest. After all of that, Wall Street still had the power to blackmail both Republicans and Democrats to give them a get-out-of-jail-free card for what they did before 2008 and to leave the basic financial structure that led to the collapse in place. If the banks were too big to fail before 2008, they're only too bigger to fail after 2008. Now, what explains this repeated inability of us to get financial regulation right? Well, there are lots of possible answers. This is a complex field. No doubt there are lots of misjudgments that come in good faith. But here's the one thing we know. The financial sector and the security sectors had the fastest growth of campaign contributions from 1990 until 2008. And in 2010, they were the largest sector by far, contributing to the congressional elections that brought about this non-reform of Wall Street. Or here's one final example. I'm sure many of you, when you saw these images, had this question in your head about this Deepwater Horizon catastrophe. How was it that such an experimental drilling platform could have been permitted without extensive environmental impact and risk studies? After all, where I come from, we have just spent 9 years and 10,000 pages of environmental impact studies to permit the building of a green energy source for producing electricity. So what was the analysis required before this experimental drilling platform was permitted? And the answer is 17 pages of environmental impact analysis before the project was exempted from any further obligation to demonstrate its safety, even in the context of experimental drilling. Now, when Congress heard this, Congress was shocked, of course.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here. You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.
Yet, of course, it had been Congress that had required this fast-track approval process. And why had Congress required a fast-track approval, even in the context of experimental technologies? Lots of possible reasons. Here's the one thing we know: endless campaign cash driving to this insane public policy choice. Now, look, no respectable liberal, libertarian, or conservative could defend these cases. Each of them is an abomination from each of these political philosophy perspectives. So how is it that they become law? Now, the political scientists are uncertain. They say the political science here is complex, but here's the one thing I'm certain of. I'm certain that you believe you know why. All I have to do is to point to the money, and you believe you know the root cause in each of these cases, and we could spend the whole night going through 1,000 other precisely analogous examples. And my claim is, it is, number one, because of cases like these, that Americans believe, quote, money buys results in Congress. 75% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress, according to a study we conducted at the beginning of the year. A little bit more Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the one thing Americans agree about: money buys results in Congress. Leading to number two, that belief erodes trust in the institutions of government. Gallup calculated last year that 11% of Americans have confidence in Congress. They said it's a little bit better this year, 12% who have confidence in Congress. But the New York Times and CBS released a poll about a month ago that says that 9% of Americans have confidence in Congress. 9%. Now, we should put that in some context, right? 9%. There were certainly more Americans at the time of the founding of the American Republic who believed in the British Crown than who believe in this Congress today. And that leads to number three: low trust erodes participation. Rock the Vote, an organization that registers and turns out young voters, and turned out the largest number of young voters in the history of the American democracy in 2008, and plainly gave Barack Obama his victory, found that in 2010 a significant number of their members were not going to vote. So they polled their members to find out why they were not going to vote. And the overwhelming result, 2-1 above the next highest answer, was, quote, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority of Americans who could have voted in 2010 did not vote, in large part because of this belief. Okay, now, it wasn't supposed to be this way. It wasn't the design of this democracy. Framers of our Constitution gave us what they called a republic. By a republic, what they meant was a representative democracy. And as the Federalist Papers explain, what they meant by a representative democracy was a government that had a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. So here's their model of government. You've got the people, you've got the government. I do my own slides. It's pretty cool the way that bounces, right, like that. The people and the government, this marionette relationship, a dependency going from the government to the people. Now, the problem is our Congress has evolved a different dependence. Not just a dependence upon the people, but increasingly a dependence upon the campaign funders. Members of Congress spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back in power. They develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters as they constantly adjust their view about what they want to do in order to make sure they can continue to raise money.